1960s, and that we're going to have to meet our responsibility as citizens. I'm talking about a national mood. I'm talking about our willingness to bear any burdens in order to maintain our own freedom and in order to meet our freedom around the globe. We don't know what the future is going to bring, but I would not want anyone to elect me President of the United States or vote for me under the expectation that life would be easier if I were elected. Mr. Vice President.
I think it may be necessary that we have more taxes. I hope not. I hope we can economize elsewhere so that we don't have to. But I would have no hesitation to ask the American people to pay the taxes, even in 1961, if necessary, to maintain a sound economy and also to maintain a sound dollar. Because when you do not tax, and tax enough to pay for your outgo, you pay it many times over in higher prices in inflation. And I simply will not do that. I think I should also add that as far as Senator Kennedy's proposals are concerned, if he intends to carry out his platform, the one adopted in Los Angeles, it is just impossible for him to make good on those promises without raising taxes or without having a rise in prices or both. The platform suggests that it can be done through economic growth, that it can be done in effect with mirrors, but it isn't going to be working that way. You can't add billions of dollars to our expenditures and not pay for it. After all, it isn't paid for by my money, it isn't paid for by his, but by the people's money.
Nixon and Kennedy had been friends ever since they came to Washington, but each knew the campaign for president was a winner-take-all race. Kennedy was the first to put on his game face. Throughout the debates, he coldly referred to the vice president as Mr. Nixon rather than as Vice President Nixon. He took issue with his friend at every opportunity. Nixon gave as good as he got, but politely referred to Kennedy
Turkey Dick is more what it is.
As the face-offs wore on, the exchanges got a little more rancorous. Nixon, representing the Eisenhower administration, took the attitude that no matter what problem the nation faced, America was still better than any other in the world.
Now, this is an important point.
Kennedy warned such an attitude would lead to complacency. He focused instead on America as a nation that was
falling short of its potential. Do you play chess with those that played worse than you, or do you play with people, chess players that are better to improve? I mean, it's a no-brainer.
That 17 million people go to bed hungry every night in the United States. Now, this just wasn't true. Now, there are people who go to bed hungry in the United States. Far less, incidentally, than used to go to bed hungry when we came into power at the end of the Truman administration. But the thing that is right about the United States that should be emphasized is that less people go to bed hungry in the United States than in any major country in the world.
Yeah, I wonder if he cares.
We're the best clothed, with a better distribution of this world's goods to all of our people than any people in history.
On a piece of
I think
paper.
we ought to emphasize America's strength.
About hunger.
It isn't necessary to run America down in order to build
You ever
it up.
hang out with someone and
Senator
eat out of the
Kennedy
garbage bucket?
As a candidate, criticize us when we're wrong. But on the other hand,
In the
he
back
has
streets
a
of
responsibility
Boston?
to be accurate. And I have
Did
a
he ever do that?
responsibility to correct him every time he misstates the case.
Tricky Dick.
Well, Mr. Nixon, I'll just give you the testimony of Mr. George Aiken, Senator George Aiken, the ranking minority member, Republican member, and former chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee, testifying in 1959, said there were 26 million Americans who did not have the income to afford a decent diet. Mr. Benson, testifying on the food stamp plan in 1957, said there were 25 million Americans who could not afford a elementary low-cost diet. And he defined that as someone who uses beans in place of meat. Now, I've seen a good many hundreds of thousands of people who are not adequately fed. You can't tell me that a surplus food distribution of 5 cents per person, and there are nearly 6 million Americans receiving that, is adequate. You can't tell me anyone who uses beans instead of meat in the United States, and there are 25 million of them, according to Mr. Benson, is well fed or adequately fed. I believe that we should not compare what our figures may be to India or some other country that has serious problems, but
There's
remember
the point.
that we are the most prosperous country in the world.
Be the
and
best
these
you
people are
can
not
be.
getting adequate food.
Don't compare
And they're not getting, in
to
many
other
cases,
people
adequate
that are
shelter,
worse.
and we ought to try to meet the
That's
problem.
Tricky
The
Dick
fourth
for
debate
you.
got personal. America and the Soviet
Tricky
Union were
Dick.
engaged in a
Dummy
Cold
Dick.
War, a competition to control international events.
You don't know.
Nixon attacked Kennedy's views that America was not living up to its potential, and he suggested that Kennedy's criticism was undermining American prestige. Both the attack and the
Typical
reaction
Republican
were bitter.
blabber.
America's prestige abroad will be just as high as the spokesman for America allow it to be.
No.
Now, when we have a presidential candidate, for example, Senator Kennedy, stating over and over again that the United States is second in space, when he states that we're second in education, that we're second in science, that we have the worst slums, that we have the most crowded schools, when he says that 17 million people go to bed hungry every night, when he makes statements like this, what does this do to American prestige? Well, it can only have the effect, certainly, of reducing it. Senator Kennedy has a responsibility to criticize
to make you to become aware of getting better.
Every one of these items that I've mentioned, dead wrong. And for that reason,
this is comedy,
he has
folks.
Contributed to any lack of prestige.
Comedy.
Comment, Senator Kennedy?
I really don't need Mr. Nixon to tell me about what my responsibilities are as a citizen. I've served this country for 14 years in the Congress, and before that in the service.
PT 109.
Just as high an opinion. What I downgrade, Mr. Nixon, is the leadership the country's getting, not the country. Now, I didn't make most of the statements that you said I made. I believe the Soviet Union is first in our
Slam him,
space.
Kennedy.
They have made more shots, the size of their rocket thrust, and all the rest. You yourself said to Khrushchev, you may be ahead of us in rocket thrust, but we're ahead of you in color television.
Color
a famous discussion in the kitchen. I think that color television is not as important as rocket thrust.
Jeez.
Secondly, I didn't say we had the worst slums in the world. I said we had too many slums.
Hit him with
but
it.
They are bad, and we ought to do something about them. And we ought to support housing legislation, which this administration is opposed. I didn't say we had the worst education in the world. I said, 10 years ago,
hit him with it.
we were producing twice as many scientists and engineers as the
Hit him with
Soviet
it.
Union, and today they're producing twice as many as we
Hit
are.
him with it.
And that this affects our security around the world. And fourth, I believe that the polls and other studies and votes in the United Nations and anyone reading the paper and any citizen of the United States must come to the conclusion that the United States no longer carries the same image of a vital society on the move with its brightest days ahead as it carried a decade or 2 decades ago.
Hit him with it.
Part of that is because we've stood still here at home, because we haven't met our problems in the United States, because we haven't had a moving economy. Part of that, as the Gallup poll showed, is because the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in outer space. Mr. George Allen, head of your information services, said that that made the people of the world begin to wonder whether we were first in science. We're first in other areas of science, but in space, which is the new science, we're not first.
Critics say the debates were more about style than substance, but the debates introduced America to places and events that would later make history. Earlier, we talked about the situation in Cuba, which remains one of the last bastions of communism today. The candidates talked about growing tensions in Berlin. Within a year, the German city was divided, half communist, half free, and it remained that way until the fall of communism in the late 1980s.
Now, the next president of the United States in his first year is going to be confronted with a very serious question on our defense of Berlin, our commitment to Berlin. It's going to be a test of our nerve and will. It's going to be a test of our strength.
Concerns were also raised about the growing communist influence in Southeast Asia. In later years, places such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became painfully familiar. The candidates alluded to the global economy and the need for nations such as Germany and Japan, which had recovered from World War II, to shoulder a greater share of economic aid to less fortunate countries. Kennedy and Nixon also discussed nuclear arms control, peace in the Middle East, the emergence of African nations, and the industrialization of Latin America. All events that have either happened or are happening today. Ironically, Nixon also talked about what would become his personal demise.
One thing I have noted as I've traveled around the country are the tremendous number of children who come out to see the presidential candidates. I see mothers holding their babies up so that they can see a man who might be president of the United States. I know Senator Kennedy sees them too. It makes you realize that whoever is president is going to be a man that all the children of America will either look up to or will look down to. And I can only say that I'm very proud that President Eisenhower restored dignity and decency and, frankly, good language to the conduct of the President of the United States.
There you go,
and I only
Tricky
hope
Dick.
that, should I win
Look
this
down
election,
to.